The horse did not like her. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Lady Philippa Darnell's visit to Wrenhollow. Not her silk travelling gown, not the impressive Darnell crest on the carriage door, not even the practiced smile she wore as she descended the steps with the careful elegance of a woman who had been trained since birth to be looked at. All of that was noted, certainly, by the assembled household staff standing in 2 precise rows along the gravel drive, but it was Corvus who made the impression that mattered. The Earl of Wrenhollow kept one horse he rode himself. One. The stables at Wrenhollow held 14 animals of exceptional breeding, but Corvus, black as a storm moving inland, 16 hands, with a temper that had unseated 3 experienced riders, was the only one the Earl touched with his own hands each morning. The grooms understood this. The household understood this. And so when Corvus, tied to his post at the paddock fence not 30 yards from the drive, flattened his ears and let out a long, low sound that was not quite a whinny, and not quite a whinny, it was unmistakably both, every member of the staff noticed. Lady Philippa did not. She was already looking past the house toward the gardens, calculating, the way people do when they are visiting a property they intend to eventually own. The woman who did notice was standing at the far end of the second row of staff, which was where she had been placed because no one was entirely certain what category she occupied. She was not a lady's maid. She was not a housekeeper. She was not a companion in the traditional sense, hired to flutter and agree and fetch shawls. She was the daughter of a baron whose estate had been sold 3 years prior to settle debts that were not hers to owe, and she had come to Wrenhollow 6 weeks ago at the arrangement of the Dowager Countess, who was the Earl's grandmother and who had decided with the certainty of a woman who had lived 81 years and stopped apologizing for her opinions around year 40 that her grandson needed someone sensible nearby. Her name was Emmeline Stratford. She was 26 years old. She had brown eyes and an unremarkable face that became, in certain lights, quietly arresting. She owned 3 dresses that were appropriate for her current circumstances, and one that was not, but that she could not bring herself to sell. She was not given to sentiment as a rule. The dress was an exception. When Corvus flattened his ears, Emmeline looked at him, then at Lady Philippa, then back at the horse. She did not say anything. She was not in a position to say anything, but she filed it away, the way she had learned to file away things that seemed small and turned out later to be not small at all. The visit had been arranged by the Earl's grandmother, which meant it had not been arranged by the Earl. This distinction was important. Lord Dorian Ashcroft, the 5th Earl of Wrenhollow, was 34 years old and had been the subject of his grandmother's matrimonial attention for approximately 11 of those years. He had resisted with the quiet, implacable stubbornness of a man who had decided early that his own judgment was reliable and other people's opinions were not his responsibility. He was not cruel about it. He simply did not acquiesce. The grief had changed the calculation slightly, which his grandmother understood, and which was why she had sent for Emmeline before she had sent for Lady Philippa. Not in those terms. She had not said, "I am sending you a sensible young woman to remind my grandson that the world still contains decent people before I parade marriageable candidates past him." She had said she needed someone to assist with correspondence and manage the household schedules while the housekeeper recovered from a broken wrist. This was true as far as it went. It simply did not go very far. Lord Dorian had lost his younger brother 18 months ago. The details were not complicated. A fever that should have broken and did not. 3 days that should have turned and did not turn. And then a silence in the east wing of Wrenhollow that had never quite been filled, because his brother had been the kind of person who filled silences without trying, the kind who whistled in the corridor, who left books face down on every horizontal surface, who appeared in doorways at unexpected hours to propose schemes that were inadvisable and that Dorian had agreed to anyway, because it was easier than saying no and because, if he was honest, he had wanted to. Emmeline had known none of this when she arrived. She had learned it the way you learn the weather in a new place. Gradually, through observation, by reading what was not said as much as what was. She learned it from the East Wing, which was kept closed. She learned it from the way the older staff spoke of before versus now, without specifying what had changed. She learned it from Corvus, who had been the younger brother's horse first, and who Lord Dorian now rode every morning, as though continuing an argument he could not finish any other way. The first time Corvus came to her, she had not done anything to earn it. She had simply been standing at the Paddock fence on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, her correspondence finished and the household schedule delivered, and no particular reason to be there except that the stables were warm, and the smell of horses was one of the few things that had remained constant across the considerable upheaval of the last 3 years. She had grown up with horses. The Baron, her father, had kept 4, and Emmeline had learned to ride before she learned her letters. And even now, when her circumstances had narrowed considerably, horses were one of the places her body remembered ease. She was not looking at Corvus. She was looking at the fields beyond, thinking about a letter she needed to draft, when she heard hoofs on the soft ground and turned to find the horse 6 feet away and approaching. She did not move, not out of bravery. She was simply a person who understood animals well enough to know that sudden movement would accomplish nothing useful. She stood still and let him come to her, and when he pressed his nose against the top of the fence post nearest her shoulder, she raised her hand slowly and set it against his jaw. He stood there for a long moment, then he exhaled, that long, settling breath horses make when something has been decided, and rested his chin over the fence rail and let her scratch the spot behind his ear. She was still there 20 minutes later when Lord Dorian came out of the stable. He stopped when he saw her. He did not say anything immediately, which she would later understand was characteristic of him. He processed things before he spoke, which many people found unsettling because they interpreted the silence as disapproval. It was not disapproval, it was simply thought. "He doesn't do that," Lord Dorian said. "I noticed he seemed inclined to," Emmeline said. There was a pause. "He threw a groom in October. He seems calmer today." Lord Dorian looked at his horse for a moment. Corvus had not moved. His chin was still resting on the rail, his eyes half closed, his posture conveying a degree of contentment that the animal rarely displayed in anyone's presence but his. "Miss Stratford," he said. Not a question. He had learned her name from the household introduction his grandmother had orchestrated, which had been brief and awkward in the way that all introductions are when one party has been placed in an ambiguous social position. "My lord," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked away, back at Corvus, and said nothing else. But he did not leave immediately either. He stood there for another few minutes, watching his horse stand quietly at the fence, and the silence between them was the kind that did not require filling. She might not have understood how much had shifted, except that Corvus made it visible. The horse had opinions and expressed them without apology. He had knocked a hat off a solicitor's head during a boundary dispute negotiation. He had refused, categorically, to allow Lord Dorian's land steward to approach him for 6 consecutive weeks following an incident no one fully explained. He was not vicious. He had never bitten, had never kicked with intent. But he was particular, and his particularity was noticed by everyone at Wrenhollow as a matter of practical safety. So when he began following Emmeline's movements along the paddock fence, with his eyes and occasionally with his whole body, it was observed. The head groom observed it and mentioned it to the undergroom. The undergroom mentioned it to the kitchen maid when he came in for his afternoon tea. The kitchen maid mentioned it to Mrs. Dunmore, the housekeeper, whose wrist had healed sufficiently for her to sit at the kitchen table and receive information with the authority of a woman who considered household intelligence part of her professional responsibility. Mrs. Dunmore did not mention it to anyone else, but Emily noticed a change in how the staff spoke to her, something slightly warmer, slightly more direct, and did not fully understand the cause until much later. Lord Dorian she saw in fragments. He was not a man who moved through his own house with any particular social intention. He did not appear at meals unless he chose to. He did not make conversation for its own sake. He managed his estate with efficiency and without apparent enjoyment, which his grandmother found alarming and Emmeline found increasingly comprehensible. They spoke first in the library. She had gone for a household account ledger and found him already there, standing at the window with a letter in his hand and an expression that suggested the letter had said something he had not wanted to read. She had taken the ledger and was nearly out the door when he said, without turning around, "Did you know my brother well?" She stopped. "I never met him, my lord." A pause. "No, of course not." He set the letter down on the window ledge. "My grandmother speaks of him often." "She does," Emmeline said carefully. "She speaks of everyone often." There was something that might have been dry humor in it, or might have been something sadder wearing humor's face. It's one of her methods. Emmeline did not respond to that, because there was nothing to respond to that would not be either too familiar or too distant. She waited. "He liked horses," Lord Dorian said. He was still looking out the window. "He's the one who found Corvus," said the horse had a personality. He meant it as a recommendation. It was accurate, Emmeline said. He turned, then, and looked at her. And there was something in his face she could not quite name, not surprise exactly, but a re-evaluation of some kind, a small revision of something he had previously assumed. "Yes," he said, "it was." She left after that, but she spent the walk back to the household office thinking about the way he had said was. Present tense for everything else. Past tense for that one word. As if he kept finding moments he had not expected would hurt and being wrong about it. Lady Philippa arrived on a Wednesday in late April, which was 3 weeks after Corvus had begun greeting Emmeline at the fence each morning, and 2 weeks after Lord Dorian had started appearing at the library at the same hour she brought the household correspondence. He had never acknowledged this coincidence. She had never mentioned it. It was simply a fact that existed in the space between them, like a great many facts at Wrenhollow that existed without being spoken. The Dowager Countess, his grandmother, who had not left her suite on the 3rd floor since Christmas, but who remained the clearest-sighted person in the house, had arranged Lady Philippa's visit with the logic of a general repositioning her forces. The Earl needed a wife. Lady Philippa was suitable. The visit would proceed. Lord Dorian had said nothing when informed of this. His silence was interpreted as consent. It was not consent. It was simply a calculation that open resistance would take more energy than he currently had, and that the visit would resolve itself through its own evidence. The evidence was Corvus. The horse refused to allow Lady Philippa within 12 feet of him. He did not charge. He simply presented his hindquarters with an eloquence that required no translation. And when her footman attempted to lead her closer to the Paddock fence where she had suggested she might like to be shown the Earl's famous stallion, Corvus pinned his ears and shifted his weight, and the footman stepped back immediately, and Lady Philippa stepped back with him and smiled a tight smile that suggested she found horses rather disagreeable anyway and could not understand why people made such a fuss. Lord Dorian stood at the Paddock fence beside Emmeline, who was there because she was always there at this hour, a fact that had apparently not been communicated to Lady Philippa's visit coordinator, and said nothing. But he watched. He watched his horse's opinion expressed with complete clarity, and he watched Lady Philippa recalibrate her smile, and he watched Emmeline stand quietly with her hand on Corvus's neck while the horse settled under her touch. He did not say anything about it until that evening, when he appeared in the doorway of the correspondence room where Emmeline was finishing the last of the household letters. "You were there this afternoon," he said. "I was," she said. She did not apologize for it. "You knew he wouldn't go to her." She looked up at that. "I thought it was possible." "You thought it was likely." She set down her pen. "I thought Corvus has consistent opinions." Something moved through his expression that she could not immediately interpret. "He does," Lord Dorian said. After a moment, "So do I." He left before she could respond. She sat for a long time looking at the door he had closed quietly behind him, and then she picked up her pen and finished the letter, because the letters needed to be finished, and because she was, fundamentally, a practical woman, but her hand was not entirely steady, and she noticed that too, with the same careful attention she gave to everything she noticed at Wrenhollow. Lady Philippa departed on a Friday. The departure was managed with perfect courtesy on all sides. Lord Dorian was present at the carriage. He said the correct things. He bowed the correct amount. Lady Philippa said she had so enjoyed the visit. The grounds were remarkable. She hoped to return in the summer. Nothing in her tone suggested she believed this. Nothing in his suggested he would welcome it. It was the Dowager Countess who clarified matters, as she had a habit of doing. She summoned Emmeline on the Saturday morning after Lady Philippa's carriage disappeared down the drive, which was not unusual. The Dowager frequently summoned Emmeline, ostensibly for correspondence and actually for conversation, because she had outlived most of the people she found interesting and was not above manufacturing proximity to the ones who remained. "Sit down," the Dowager said from her chair by the window where she managed her empire of observations. She was 81 years old and looked rather like a bird that had decided to dress as an aristocrat. Small, precise, with eyes that moved faster than anything else about her. "I want to ask you something directly, and I should like a direct answer." "Of course," Emmeline said. "Are you in love with my grandson?" The question landed in the room with the weight of something that had been present for some time and simply said aloud. Emmeline did not answer immediately because she was not a person who answered immediately to things that deserved consideration. She looked at her hands. She thought about the library and the Paddock fence, and the way he had said was, and the way he had said so, "Do I?" and the way Corvus exhaled when she arrived, that settling breath of something decided. "I respect him," she said finally, "very much." The Dowager looked at her with the expression of a woman who had seen every variety of human evasion across 8 decades and found them all charming in their inadequacy. "That's not what I asked." "No," Emmeline said, "it isn't." There was a silence. "Well," the Dowager said, and her tone had shifted into something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. "At least you're honest about not answering." What happened next happened slowly, the way most things that matter do. Lord Dorian began appearing in places he had not previously appeared. The kitchen garden on a Tuesday afternoon when Emmeline was speaking with the gardener about the herb beds. The upper corridor outside the estate office, twice at the hour she typically finished the household accounts, once, memorably, at the Paddock fence at sunrise, which was the 1 hour she had thought was entirely her own, and she had turned to find him there, and had said nothing, and he had said nothing, and they had both stood watching the light change over the east fields while Corvus moved between them like punctuation. He had started, she noticed, calling her Emmeline in moments when the formality lapsed, not the formal Miss Stratford he had begun with, but the name itself, without prefix, which in their particular context and century was a small and significant thing. She had not corrected him. She had, without quite deciding to, begun thinking of him as Dorian, in the private ledger of her own mind, though she had not yet said it aloud. The Dowager, who knew everything that happened at Wrenhollow by methods that remained opaque but were clearly effective, said nothing further on the subject. She simply began inviting them both to her suite for afternoon tea on Thursdays, framing it as a household coordination meeting that fooled no one. The resolution came in the library, which was fitting, because the library was where something had first shifted between them. She had gone for a map of the northern tenant farms, which she needed for a correspondence she was drafting with the estate steward, and she had found him already there, as she so often did, and he had looked up from his desk and said, "Emmeline." Just that. Her name. "My lord," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about a number of things." She waited. She had learned to wait with him. He thought before he spoke, always, and what he said when he finally spoke was always worth the silence. "I have been thinking," he said again, "that Corvus has better instincts than I have been willing to trust, and that the people I have trusted over the past 18 months have generally been people he had no quarrel with." He paused. "And that you have been at Wrenhollow for 4 months, and the house is quieter in a way I didn't expect, and I believe that is because of you, and I am not sure how to account for it except directly." He came around the desk. He stopped at a distance that was respectful and aware. "I am asking," he said, "if you would be willing to remain, not as—" He stopped. Started again. "I am asking if you would be willing to remain as my wife, if that is something you could want." He looked at her with the steadiness of a man who had thought this through and arrived at the end of his thinking and was now in the territory beyond it. "I understand if it is not." Emmeline looked at him. She thought about her 3 appropriate dresses and the one she could not sell. She thought about the East Wing and what it meant that he rode Corvus every morning. She thought about her horse pressing his chin over a fence rail and exhaling, and how she had recognized that exhale because she had felt it herself, somewhere in the past 4 months. That particular settling, that sense of something decided. "Dorian," she said. His name. For the first time, she watched him hear it. "Yes," she said. The Dowager cried, briefly, and then denied it, which was fully consistent with everything Emmeline knew of her. The household, upon receiving the news, responded with the particular warmth of a staff who had been waiting for something for a long time and were relieved to see it arrive. Mrs. Dunmore produced a fruitcake from somewhere that no one could fully account for, and no one asked. Corvus was given an extra measure of feed that evening by the head groom, who felt this was appropriate. The only difficult conversation was with the Dowager's sister-in-law, a Lady Harriet Osgood of considerable opinions and less considerable tact, who arrived uninvited the following week and said, in the formal sitting-room with tea cooling in her cup, that she was certain the Earl understood the irregularity of the match, a baron's daughter, quite without resources, and hoped he had given appropriate consideration to what was owed to the family name. Lord Dorian looked at his grandmother's sister-in-law for a moment with the same expression he had turned on Lady Philippa when Corvus presented his hindquarters. "I have given it exactly the consideration it deserves," he said, and the matter was settled. Emmeline did not say anything. She did not need to. She poured the tea and passed a cup to Lady Harriet and smiled, because she was not a woman who wasted energy on battles that had already been won. The wedding was in June in the small church at the edge of the estate, with the Dowager in the front pew and the household staff filling the remaining seats and Corvus in the churchyard, because the head groom had led him there on an impulse, and Lord Dorian had looked out the vestry window and laughed, a real laugh, uncalculated, the kind that arrives before you can decide about it. And Emmeline, hearing it, thought, there it is, the thing she had been waiting to hear from him without knowing she was waiting. They planted roses in the East Wing garden that autumn. It had been his brother's favorite part of the grounds, and had been left unattended since. Emmeline had suggested it, and Dorian had been quiet for a long moment, and then said yes, and they had done it together on a Saturday morning with their hands in the cold October earth, and the horse had watched them from the paddock fence with his chin on the rail and his eyes half closed, as settled and certain as he had been on a Tuesday in March when he had crossed a paddock and made up his mind.